Welcome back to the United Taste of America podcast from iHeart Podcast. I am Rick K. Jones, your tour guide for our journey today to the sixth state in the Union, and that state is Massachusetts. You know, every state in the Union is important, but few, or if none, are more important to our country's founding than Massachusetts. It played such a huge role in the early days of our country and in our Revolutionary War, which we'll talk about today. Most everybody knows the story of the Mayflower and the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock. When they landed, they found a significant number of Native American tribes, including the namesake Massachusetts tribe. That's where the name comes from. There today are over 35 million Americans who are descendants from those people that were on the Mayflower. That's pretty crazy. Little small ship comes to America, and now there are 35 million Americans who are descendants from those folks. These include some people like actors Meryl Streep, Matt Damon, Alec Baldwin, Clint Eastwood, and the late Humphrey Bogart, along with Franklin Roosevelt, Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote Little House on the Prairie, Taylor Swift, you may have heard of her, and author Ernest Hemingway. Pretty amazing. There was a passenger on the Mayflower by the name of Henry Sampson. And one day, poor old Henry fell overboard into the sea, but fortunately he was rescued. And two of his descendants grew up to be presidents of the United States, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. So obviously your descendants matter. The Pilgrims were English who had previously left England for religious reasons and gone to Holland. They'd gone to the Netherlands, and then they came to America directly from there. If you know the story of the Pilgrims, that first winter was brutal. They got to Massachusetts too late to plant crops, you know. I always wonder what it would be like to get on a ship and go someplace where you had no idea where you were going. They had no idea where they were going. They get there too late to plant crops. It is a horrible, cold, miserable winter. But fortunately, the Native American tribes of the area saved them and fed them and showed them a lot of things that allowed them to survive, I'm sure including eating things like oysters. And as you know, later that year, once the harvest came in, they collectively celebrated what we know is the first Thanksgiving in 1621. Massachusetts really began to grow with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. There were a bunch of settlements in Salem and in Boston, and then later in Springfield, back to the west of Massachusetts. Then, though, they started having issues with the Native Americans, and I can understand it. You know, you're a Native American, you've been there for centuries. Suddenly these Europeans show up. They show up with two things: diseases, number one, that you caught and didn't have any immunities to, and secondly, this desire for their own land. And if you know the Native Americans, the land was for everyone. You leased the land or you borrowed the land as you moved around. No. Europeans, I want my land. I want to put a fence around my land. I want to put, cattle on my land. I want to do these kinds of things. And so it caused a lot of wars in Massachusetts. And we went for several decades where there were just a number of major wars between European settlers and the Native Americans. But finally, unfortunately, the natives were almost wiped out. And again, a lot of it was by disease. And once they were wiped out, then the colony really began to grow with farming, ultimately with banking. Massachusetts became, in the New World, the banking headquarters. And with shipbuilding. Shipbuilding continued to be very, very important. Shipbuilding, if you've studied Massachusetts and Cape Cod and Nantucket and some of those places, whaling was a big industry of that era. And so they would build whaling ships that would go out and again, kill the whales, drag them back, and they were killed largely for their blubber, which was used for oil, for lighting lamps and those types of things in order to have that during that period. Massachusetts really was a leader in leading the effort to leave England, to declare our independence. You know those names. People like John Adams, who became the second president of the United States, Paul Revere, the famous ride of Paul Revere, John Hancock, largest signature on the Declaration of Independence, and Sam Adams. Sam Adams was John Adams' cousin. He was a brewer, and so like even today you can buy Sam Adams beer named for him, but he originally was a brewer. But he was very, very political, almost the largest rebel that wanted to leave England for a variety of reasons. And what were those reasons? It's always economics, isn't it? It's always about money. England was trying to fund wars, European wars, and they felt like the best way to fund the war was to tax the colonies. And the colonists really rebelled because of the fact that they wanted to be treated like all other Englishmen. They weren't taxing the Englishmen in England, but they were taxing the Englishmen in the colonies, and so it was always about money. It's always been about money, and so they decided at that point that it was time to potentially leave the mothership and start our own country. Early on, we protested some things, and there was a thing called the Boston Massacre. And the Boston Massacre was where there was a protest. You know, we recently had a lot of protests in cities like Minneapolis and Seattle over ICE and other things. They were protesting, and British troops got a little antsy. Somebody fired the first shot. It's never been determined exactly who did that. But the British troops fired back, and unfortunately, a couple of people were killed. And the first person that was killed to start the Revolutionary War was a half Native American, half African American freedman by the name of Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was the first American killed in the Revolution. After that, we had a tax on tea, and tea was very important. But it was kind of symbolic also. It was like, if you can tax tea, what else can you tax? And so you know the story that a number of the colonists dressed up like Native Americans came to the ship, raided the ship, grabbed the tea, tossed it into the harbor, the famous Boston Tea Party. That led to escalating the conflict, and then we really had our first battle at Lexington and Concord. That was called the Shots Heard Around the World. And then after that, there was the Battle of Bunker Hill, and then we were kind of off to the races for that point, because at that point, John Adams really became the leader for independence, and like I mentioned before, later served as the second president of our United States. Massachusetts played a huge role in the war. And sent lots of troops. In many cases, these were farmers. These were poorer people. The history of war has always been the same. Rich people send poor people to fight. A lot of poor people left their farms, joined General Washington, and were part of the troops that fought. You know, Washington in the war, you know, really kind of realized he didn't have to win the war. He just didn't have to lose the war. Now think about that. I don't have to win it. I just can't lose it. Because the longer the war went on, the more expensive it became for the British. And remember, we're fighting wars on multiple fronts, European wars, now wars in the colonies. They go through an economic crisis, King George III, and ultimately, it was the money, it was the politics where they just lost their will. The English people lost their will to fund the fighting in the colonies, and that led ultimately to our success of forming our own United States of America. After the war, Massachusetts really grew largely on the back of textile mills. If you know the history of textiles, they were big in England. England led the Industrial Revolution. It led to a lot of the wealth that created things like ships and other things that led to what we call the British Empire, where they traveled around the world and planted their flag and said, this is English territory, all kinds of places, including obviously the United States, India, other places. Textiles. They were able to manufacture clothing, cloth, other kinds of things. Well, economics, again, they found out it was cheaper to move the textile mills to New England from England, and Massachusetts really led that. And if you drive through Massachusetts today, you find so many little mill towns. No more mills there, or very few mills there. There are a few. There are a few in certain places in Massachusetts, but mostly those old mills have been converted to condos, townhouses, office buildings, restaurants, those types of things. Later, though, again, economics, the mills, they found out they could make things cheaper where? In the South, in the American South. And so the mills moved to Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina out of New England. And that really created some problems. And then, ultimately the mills moved to Mexico and then on to Asia and other places. At this point, Massachusetts really fell on hard times. But then they had something what they call the miracle of Massachusetts in the 1980s. And this is when suddenly a lot of companies began to build technology centers in Massachusetts. And again, the banking finance community kind of consolidated around Boston and other areas. And it led to significant growth. Massachusetts has produced 4 presidents of the United States. The previously mentioned John Adams, later his son, ran and won the presidency, served 1 term, John Quincy Adams. Quincy Adams was defeated in his 2nd term by Andy Jackson. John Kennedy was from Massachusetts. And George Herbert Walker Bush was born in Massachusetts. He's better known for being either from Connecticut or from West Texas, but he was born in Massachusetts. We have a very fun and diverse musical playlist today of songs about or artists from Massachusetts. The first song on the playlist is from the Bee Gees. It is a song called, believe it or not, Massachusetts. It's a classic. Then there's a song by Dave Loggins that some of you older folks may remember called Please Come to Boston, which was a big hit in that era. The Standells were a rock band, and they had a wonderful song called Dirty Water, kind of one-hit wonder. The Dirty Water was about the water in Boston Harbor. James Taylor wrote a wonderful song about his nephew called Sweet Baby James, where he mentions living and recording and being part of the society in the Berkshires in western Massachusetts. And then the great Arlo Guthrie also wrote a song called Massachusetts. We have a really fun playlist today, so I encourage you to listen to that. So let's talk about the famous foods from Massachusetts, and there are quite a few. Let's start with seafood. Again, big coastline, famous for clams, famous for fish, famous for chowders. Again, cold nights, fish and clam chowders that really work on those cold New England days and nights. They have a famous dish called scrod. Scrod is cod. And remember, at the time of the founding of Massachusetts, off of the banks outside of Massachusetts were great schools of codfish. Though, unfortunately, we overfished them, as we do often. And ultimately, almost 100% of the cod went away. The good news now is because of a lot of legislation and a lot of smart fishing, cod is coming back in a big way off the coast of New England. But one of the famous dishes that they have is called scrod, and it's a baked cod with butter and breadcrumbs. So it is really a cod casserole. Fabulous dish. There are a lot of dishes that were created in Boston, named for Boston. We all know about Boston baked beans. It's beans, molasses, and pork. So they cook it for a long period of time, sweeten it, have a little pork fat in it. Wonderful dish. There were two dishes that were actually invented at a famous hotel in Boston called the Parker House Hotel. We all know Parker House rolls, yeast rolls, one of the first places that they did those, Parker House rolls. And they also invented a famous dessert called Boston cream pie. Boston cream pie was created at the famous Parker House Hotel. I'm always fascinated by where dishes actually came from. You know, who was the first person that made this, where two of those dishes came from the Parker House Hotel. The Parker House Hotel is an Omni Hotel in Boston today. You can go there and stay today, and you can have, open your meal with some Parker House rolls and end your meal with the Boston cream pie. Cranberries grow throughout Massachusetts in the bogs. And the cranberry farmers ultimately put together a co-op. And they named that co-op Ocean Spray. And so today, Ocean Spray is a farm co-op that creates things like cranberry sauce, fresh cranberries, and clearly cranberry juice is the leading one, where they take the juice and make it. Pepsi actually distributes Ocean Spray products, but they don't own them. They distribute them. Ocean Spray is still owned by all of the farmers. They have a famous dessert in Massachusetts called Indian pudding. It's cornmeal, molasses, ginger, nutmeg, and cinnamon. Again, it's like a cobbler. Indian pudding. It's really good with vanilla ice cream on top. Get it really, really hot. Put the cold ice cream on there. Let it melt a little bit. Wonderful, wonderful dish. Another corn dish famous in Massachusetts are called Johnny cakes. They're really famous all throughout New England. These are corn pancakes, again, served with maple syrup that comes from the area. They're also famous for a lot of apples and apple products in Massachusetts, and one of their most famous desserts are called apple cider donuts. And so you can get these wonderful donuts made with apple cider. But our featured dish was actually invented in Massachusetts and served throughout the state. This dish is the fried clam. Can you believe it? We know exactly where and when the fried clam was invented. The fried clam was invented in Essex, Massachusetts, at a wonderful restaurant called Woodmans of Essex. I've got a book today to show you. This is a book that was printed in 2014, 100 years. It's called Woodmans of Essex, a Yankee tradition since 1914, 5 generations of stories with 100 years of recipes. And so you've got this wonderful book with the history of the Woodman family. They still own the place. It's the 4th and 5th generation that are now running it. Woodmans of Essex. Let's talk a little bit about Woodmans. Again, started in 1914 by a guy named Henry Woodman. Henry Woodman kind of had a big barrel chest that ultimately, unfortunately, moved a little south. So he got a little belly, and he got a nickname called Chubby. Henry Chubby Woodman. And as I mentioned before, we're now at Woodman's with the 4th generation that is running this restaurant. Well, Chubby and his wife, Bessie, started a roadside stand selling whatever they could. You know where Essex is? It's on a peninsula, and there is a road between a number of small New England towns. And so a lot of traffic in the early turn of the last century would come through there. So he set up a stand on the side of the road, literally right on the estuary. And he sold things like fruit and gum and cigarettes, homemade pies. But what he really sold a lot of were buckets of soft shell clams, because he literally could walk a few feet away from his stand every day and dig for fresh clams. And so he's digging for clams in the estuaries, in the local salt marsh, on the mud flats, and selling them. Well, at this time, about 1916, one of the most famous dishes that was served as a snack food were potato chips. Supposedly, potato chips were invented in New York. When we talk about New York, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But they were invented in Saratoga, New York. And so people didn't call them potato chips. They called them Saratoga chips. Well, on July 3rd of 1916, they run out of potatoes. They don't have any more potato chips. And somebody suggests to Chubby, well, why don't you fry up a clam? Well, he'd never done that before. And so basically, they batter and fry the clams in lard, and the rest is history. They still use today at Woodmans the exact same recipe of what they used for the first fried clam. They dip the clams in evaporated milk, then in corn flour, not cornmeal. Corn flour it's not as coarse. It's ground, almost like wheat flour. And then they fry it in lard. You can use Crisco, but lard is what they use. They've tried over the years to use other oils. They just don't taste as good. So why mess up a good thing? And so he started selling, amongst other things, fried clams. And that led to building a big restaurant literally on the estuary. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes too. Now, he got known for being this creator of fried clams. And so there was a young entrepreneur that heard about it. And this entrepreneur was going to be opening both motels, remember those, and a restaurant connected to the motel, and his name was Howard Johnson. And for those of a certain era, certain age, you remember Howard Johnson motor courts and their restaurants. And what was Howard Johnson's famous for? Fried clams. Well, he learned to fry clams from Chubby Woodman. Now, they're different, because what he found out is soft-shelled clams are fried with the whole clam. The bellies, the legs, all of that, the strips together. Soft-shell clams don't last long. They don't freeze well. So ultimately, Howard Johnson went to more quahog clams and just clam strips that you could harvest and freeze, batter, and fry. In fact, you could batter them, freeze them so that they're ready to go in. But I think it's pretty interesting that Howard Johnson learned to fry clams from Chubby Woodman. Now, today, fried clams are literally sold all over New England, but they actually started at Woodman's. I've gotten to know some people, the Woodman family, Steve and Rhonda, fourth generation, Steve and his wife, Rhonda. The Woodman people are just tremendous. The story of Woodman's is just amazing. All the charity work they did over the years. They cater. You can have clam bakes. You can have, all kinds of unique things. I first learned about Woodman's years ago. If you remember last week's show on Connecticut, Francis Rosselli, he talked about a book called Roadfood. Roadfood was written by a married couple named Jane and Michael Stern back in, the 1970s. And that book put Pepe's on the map, as Francis talked about. But that's where I found out about Woodman's. I was reading in Roadfood and happened to be in New England and read about Woodman's and went there for the first time. And I have to admit this, it may be my favorite restaurant in America. It's just a combination of everything. The history, the land, it sits on this estuary, and then the food is amazing. Now, when you get there, let me give you some tips. Tip number one is you got to park the car someplace, and you're going to have to park in the parking lot. If it's full, you got to park on the street down the road. Drop off your party before you go park, and then divide and conquer. Somebody gets in the line to get the fried clams, French fries, shrimp, chowder, corn, everything you can think about eating. Somebody else gets in a line outside. What's outside? It's the lobster pound. You see the lobsters, and you go, I want that one, that big one, I want that one, and then you watch them cook it, and then they split it for you, and you're ready. And then somebody else gets in the third line where you go get a cold beer or iced tea or soft drink, and then you put it all together, and you go out back on the estuary at a picnic table and sit outside and eat just great New England seafood. There's probably nothing better. I can remember a few years ago, I had a meeting in downtown Boston. I decided to come in early, in fact, a day early, just to go to Woodmans again. So I landed at Boston Logan Airport, rented a car, and drove up to Cape Ann to Essex and ate at Woodmans. Let me tell you this, it's worth the drive pretty much from any place. Woodmans of Essex, the fried clam. But folks, there are a lot of other great places to eat, great spots in Massachusetts. So here's my weekly 3 from me. There's a wonderful restaurant near Faneuil Hall, historical place in downtown Boston, called the Union Oyster House. It's been there since colonial periods. They make amazing clam chowder. That's what you want to start with. Cold day in Boston, big bowl of clam chowder. Homemade oyster crackers. Homemade, really, really good. And then you want to follow that with that baked scrod we talked about earlier, that scrod casserole. Chowder, scrod, need I say more? Union Oyster House. Second place is one of my favorite restaurants on Cape Cod. I love to go to Cape Cod. Let me tell you a little bit about Cape Cod for another road trip. There's a thing called the Cape Cod Baseball League in the summertime. These are college players that come play on teams in each of the little teeny towns on Cape Cod, and they live in homes. And what's interesting is college baseball today, they play with aluminum bats. Not in the Cape Cod League. They're getting you ready to play professional baseball. You play with wooden bats, which is kind of neat because a lot of college kids haven't played with wooden bats. All the little towns there, Hyannis, Brewster, Dennis, Camden, Chatham, Provincetown, they all have a team. And they have a little ball field right in the middle of that little town. And you may pay a couple of dollars to do it. And they all have great food. So when you go in the summertime, you want to go to a different baseball game every day to watch the baseball, but mostly to eat the food. Like some place has great chowder, some place has great corn, some place has great burgers, that kind of thing. Well, one of my favorite little towns in Cape Cod is the little town of Dennis. Dennis also has, beside a baseball team, they have a little theater. They have a theater there, and a lot of great, big, successful Broadway and motion picture stars started their careers in the Dennis Theater. And so every year I think they have maybe rotating 3 to 5 different plays. I can remember years ago being there and going to see a wonderful play called Forever Plaid. Forever Plaid is the story of the 1950s. There were these boy groups that wore plaid and sang a cappella songs of that era. And this play is about a group that forms a band, and they're on their way to their first gig at a Holiday Inn, and they get killed in an automobile accident, and the good Lord lets them come back to earth for the one show. one show because they've worked so hard to be a singing group. It's a wonderful little play called Forever Plaid. Well, in Dennis, I'm getting to it, folks. There's this great breakfast legendary place to eat called the Red Cottage Restaurant. It is legit. I'm a legit breakfast guy. I like late breakfast, about 10:30, after you've been up for a while, you're starving, and they make what is one of my favorite dishes. It's French toast Foster. Now, you may know that in New Orleans, we'll talk about that when we talk about Louisiana, at Brennan's restaurant, they created a thing called Bananas Foster for a guy named Foster. The same premise. It's French toast with basically Bananas Foster on top of French toast, okay? No calories, well, at least none less than 4,000 calories. Bananas Foster, French toast Foster at the Red Cottage Restaurant in Dennis. And then in the Berkshires, there are a lot of great, great restaurants, but one of my favorites is a place called the Old Inn on the Green. What a great name for that, huh? Old Inn on the Green. Started in 1760 in New Marlborough, Massachusetts, right there in the Berkshires. Where do they serve? The classic New England gourmet foods, Yankee pot roast, clam cakes, baked scrod, just all the great New England classics in a really high-end place. The Old Inn on the Green. Those are my three from me today from the great state of Massachusetts. So, folks, that's our show today from Massachusetts. A lot of great and memorable dishes, including those amazing, wonderful fried clams from Woodmans of Essex. We'll see you next week from state number 7 in our union, and that state would be Maryland. We'll see you next time.